this is billed as our birthday celebration. So this is one way we're thinking of the commemoration of the 800th anniversary of the first rule of the Third Order in 1221, which was the rule of the Third Order in our province when it was founded by Father Joseph. So we do have a direct connection to this anniversary. Some people thought, well, why are we doing this? Well, actually, it's kind of in our DNA in a way, here in the American province. I sent a listing of Margaret's kind of CV, her many accomplishments and contributions to our Franciscan family. What maybe did not come out as clearly was she's also been a pioneer in terms of the place of women in the Franciscan movement, not just her work on Clare and Clare's life and rule, but her own life. She was the first woman to receive a doctorate from the Antonianum in Rome, the Franciscan University in Rome. She was the first woman to direct the Franciscan Institute and the first woman to be president of St. Bonaventure University. Indeed, I guess, of any Franciscan university, right? Margaret and I met many, many moons ago at the Franciscan Institute in the days where there were legendary characters there, at the start of a lot of the excitement of the Franciscan studies. And she even graciously acceded to being a lector at my priesthood ordination. I won't say how many years ago that was. So it was great over these past 2 years. I think we reconnected first right before the pandemic to reconnect with Margaret. And she's been very helpful to me personally as I discern and think on my Third Order vocation. So, without further ado, I introduce our Third Order sister, Margaret Carney.
Charlie, thank you very, very much. And as you can all see from Charlie's introduction, there's something about the bonds among Franciscans that survive time and survive earthquake changes in one's life and one's spiritual path. And so I am very, very honored by this invitation. I want to make two statements before I get into the content. The first is I am doing a lot of work with the Federation of Sisters and Brothers of the Third Order Regular here in the United States. And one of the desires that keeps bubbling up is to create stronger bonds with Franciscans of other faith communities and communions. And I think it will take us a while to initiate an action on that desire, simply because doing that requires, I think, thoughtful approaches and knowing who are the persons most likely to be good conversation partners for such a venture. So I'm really hoping that my work with you this morning might be part of building that bridge. The other thing I want to say is that obviously, when I speak of Franciscan history and the events of Franciscan history, I am speaking from the standpoint of someone who studies it within the Roman Catholic community. And so that influence is going to be there. But I like to remind people that there were 3 centuries of Franciscan activity before the Reformation. And so I think that it's important for us to consider that the Franciscan spirit and Franciscan identity holds a power for unity and common purpose that should not have to keep suffering from the disunities that were created in that historic period and which continue until today, although we know that really heroic ecumenical efforts are trying to overcome that. So I just offer that point as a bit of a caveat. So you're celebrating a birthday, and I'm going to feel to you, I'm sure, like I just put you into a classroom and I'm walking you through a lot of material that has very much of a lecture in history about it. And I apologize in the beginning for that, but I really believe sincerely that one of the great Franciscan tasks of our time is the recovery of the importance and the role of the earliest lay participants in the Franciscan movement, which then became a set of legally recognized orders. Darlene Price, who's a professor at the Franciscan School of Theology now at the University of San Diego, used to be in Berkeley, has also called very strongly for this kind of effort. And I think it's true that it's been a preoccupation of mine, along with my study of Franciscan women for many decades already. And so I'm going to ask you to bear with the historical background, because where it's leading us is, I believe, to uncover a richness in our origins that few, even some of the greatest Franciscan historians, have completely missed. So if you could, if you buckle your seatbelts, we'll get onto this ride and we'll start moving. And I will stop. There are basically 4 or 5 sections to this. So I'm going to hit the pause button at the end of each section, so that if you have a question, you're not waiting such a long time, and I have time to clarify anything as we go forward. So let me begin by pointing out that there is a really strong experience right now in the United States of excluded groups demanding that their role in our US history be reimagined, re-understood, and included in books, in teaching, in consciousness. Those excluded groups are numerous. It would be African American citizens. It would be Latino, Latinx citizens. It's been women for quite a long time. And I point that out because I think it is a movement of our time that these excluded voices are being brought to the center of our attention. In America, it has sadly taken tragedies like the murder of George Floyd to recenter that conversation. But I feel as though what I am doing with you today is a parallel to that. That one of the voices of Franciscan history is the third order voice. And we suffer from the fact that from the very beginning, they started using numerals to identify the segments of the family. And somehow third always feels like you won the last prize. Does it not? Like, I came in third. Wow. So, and actually, I think I've heard some courageous historians suggest we should really flip it, that the lay penitents preceded the friars, which in some regards is very accurate. So that's one problem. The second problem, the history of the Franciscan movement, by and large, has been preserved, taught, chronicled, researched by friars who belong to the first order and who are often motivated in their study to solve the issues that they experience around their identity, around their practice, around their observance of the rule. There are, of course, exceptions. Probably the most prominent early exceptions were the British experts, the British Society of Franciscan Studies, with the great names of Bishop Robinson and Beryl Smalley and others who made extraordinary contributions to our understanding of Franciscan history. Most of them centered around the great schools of Oxford or Cambridge and so on. Today, the expertise is really in the hands of an army of lay scholars, most of them still Western European. But I think the point I want to make is, if we don't have a good grasp on our history, and I'm saying our, meaning the lay members of the Franciscan order, it's because there was never a centralized government and a set of resources that allowed third order members to build up study centers, to manage archives, to have libraries. And even though the first order in the Roman Catholic Church is in 3 separate branches, each of those branches has always made it a priority to have members who are scholars, to have excellent libraries, to preserve archives, etc. Third order membership was so dispersed, so decentralized, that it is really a very different task to try to go back and find original documents, original stories, the accurate names and dates and places of so many of the wonderful founding events and experiences. So I want to say that that is one of the obstacles that we need to overcome going forward. Sister Deborah Lockwood is the president of the International Third Order Regular Conference, and she reported to us in a meeting yesterday that over the Feast of St. Francis, she visited the little town of Canara in Italy, where Francis is said to have invested the very first penitents or lay members. And she said the people were thrilled. They don't get a lot of visits in Canara because it doesn't have the cachet of the basilicas of Assisi and so on. But I was delighted that she had the imagination and the determination to show respect for that moment in our history. So I want to go forward, and I'm not, my idea here is I'm not denigrating or devaluing the historical work that's been done through the centuries. And, I mean, Charlie and I stand on the shoulders of those giants, even if some of them were really colorful figures back in the faculty days that the faculty that taught us. But the point is, the time is well past due for a rethinking of this important aspect of the Third Order's history. I also think it's important because the way in which we understand Franciscan events is colored by where we stand in the family photograph. You know, if you imagine a family sitting for the photograph that's going to be their Christmas card, or, you know, the picture they give to the great-grandparents on their wedding anniversary, and you look at who are all the members of that vast Franciscan family, I think that we bring, those of us who are not in that more clerical first order, bring really important insights to understanding. And I'll just give one example because I think it points up the illustration of having different points of view about how Franciscan life evolves. When I was studying at the Antonianum, my mentor was Father Regis Armstrong, who's done monumental work of translating the Franciscan sources. And I was working with him on the Rule of St. Clare, but basically he was preparing the early volume published by Paulus Press of the collection of her writings, or writings about her. So he was looking at the document of her canonization called the bull, named after the bulla, the waxen seal that's put on it. And he said, oh, it's clear that the Pope loved her. It's clear that he couldn't say enough about her. It's, and he's going on about how, the writing of this document shows such love for Clare. So I was reading it and I said, Regis, have you paid attention to what virtue of Clare gets the most praise? And he just looked at me. And I said, over and over and over, she is praised for being silent. In other words, being a woman who gave no trouble. And I said, we know she wasn't silent all the time, that she literally debated with cardinals and popes. So I said, yeah, it's a very beautiful testimonial to her, but they selected the one thing that Roman bishops and cardinals were interested in, which was women who would be subservient. Well, of course, Regis was a little rocked back on his heels by that observation. But I think it's an example of how our different places in the family allow us to see and interpret events differently. So let's start to move forward. And Charlie, I think if we can put up the part 2, Francis, a penitent from Assisi. I don't know if we can do the screen share at this point or not. Okay, so problems with Franciscan history is the segment that I just completed. And we're going to move on now to how Francis, in the very beginning, identified himself as a penitent. And I want to say this right now, but I'm going to come back to it later. When we speak of penitent, order of penance, please in your head, put immediately the translation of that term to the converted one. The person who has experienced an evangelical conversion of life. And I'll come back and we'll try to unpack that a bit more. But we need to use the language that Francis himself used, that his biographers used in describing him. And so I'm going to stay with that language for now. We know that Francis, in the very earliest stage of his conversion, in those early years when he had heard the message from the cross at San Damiano, had encountered Jesus in the leper, had attempted a military career and been a prisoner, and then attempted it a second time and was turned back by the mystical dream that he had. In those early years of searching, he adopted a form of living that any medieval person would recognize as that of a penitent. So we see him looking for time for prayer. We see him helping poor priests and poor churches, the rebuilding of the 3 chapels there in Assisi. We see him enter into physical penance and discipline, fasting, night vigils. These are all characteristics of a way of being Christian that was shared by many individuals in the medieval church. In other words, he gradually conformed his life to the life of persons who were recognized not as monks, not as nuns, but as lay persons whose converted consciousness put them at the service of monasteries and churches and bishops. So what I want to help us understand is what was this way of life and where does it come from? And so what we want to do is then go to the next outline, which speaks to the penitence, the evolution of the order of penance. So let me offer some comments about that. The order of penance is a very, very ancient. Okay, here we are. This A, B, C, D, E. Those are the points that I've just made. But let me unpack a couple of these. What is the structure that he is subscribing to? What is it that allows him to say, when they say, well, who are you? I'm a penitent. When the first friars go out to preach and to witness, and they say, what should we say? Who do we say we are? He said, tell them you are penitents from Assisi. So even his very first followers were seen under that rubric, under that name. So he's entered into a state that is publicly recognized. And it would be helpful, I think it is helpful for us to realize that we too, as the lay followers of Francis in the Third Order, are living out of a really deep root system in Christian spirituality. So what is the evolution of that penitential identity in the church? First, once the very first generation of Christian teaching passed, and it became clear that the second coming was not going to be immediate, Christians had the problem of making a determination. What do you do with someone who has ruptured his or her relationship with the Christian community by serious sin? In other words, they are excommunicated by reason of the sin they have committed. There was no provision for that at the very first, because Christians were baptized believing the end of the world was at hand. And this longer lifespan in which one falls and fails was not a common experience. Once it became a common experience, what was to be done? And so in those early centuries, the bishop would have the office to impose a penance, some rigorous experience of fasting or making a pilgrimage or tithing, that would allow the sinner to make amends and then re-enter into the Christian community. So in the very beginning stages, it's clearly a discipline imposed on those who have really messed up and for some reason have to be excluded from the community until they can make amends, if they are willing to make amends. However, as the church becomes more and more challenged, once it is an accepted religion, following, of course, Constantine's era, and ordinary people become Christians, not always out of a total religious conviction, but because now it's what the emperor believes, and if you want to be in the good graces of the culture, you follow that path. So now you've got Christian communities where the commitment to a truly Christian way of life is suffering because it's, in a sense, polluted by too much worldliness, too much assimilation by culture. And so various heroes and heroines of Christian living judgment is itself an alternative. So we think of the desert fathers and mothers. We think of the earliest monks. They remove themselves from society, but they engage in those same activities: bodily penance, long vigils of prayer, work that helps to restructure the church physically or materially or spiritually. And so the penitential spirituality moves into being identified with those who voluntarily accept a way of life that's very disciplined and meant to be a kind of shock treatment to Christians who have become lax. There are voices within our Catholic Church today who call for a similar type of removal called the Benedict option. It's not about Pope Benedict, it's about the monk Benedict, that those who want to preserve their faith better think about fleeing, to a kind of quasi-monastic way of living. And then as the church progresses and the practice of personal confession of sin develops, the idea of penance also becomes better known as that action which I do to atone for my sins, even though I'm not excommunicated, but I've gone to confession, I have shared my failings against the gospel, against the church, against my vocation, and I am given something to do or to pray as a form of atonement. So this line of development is very ancient, from first century penitents, being reconciled to the church, from the late antiquity, the monks fleeing worldly contagion, straight up to the early Middle Ages, where there are persons always seeking a way to commit to a different life form, but who may not be able to go to a monastery or enter into the clerical state. And there were many medieval church reformers, lay reformers, who found that this state in life was perfect because it allowed them to do their reforming work in the midst of the people. They weren't enclosed in a monastery, but it gave them a kind of plan for living that allowed them to stay dedicated to goals of personal holiness and a holiness that they could share with others. And so we see that Francis, in the earliest stage of his conversion, has already knows of this penitential way of life, and his early choices correspond to that early way of life that he has embraced. So let me stop here for a moment. Let's declare a pause of 3 or 4 minutes. If you have a question, if you'd like to put it in chat, I see some questions have already come up, so I'm going to ask for some help with hearing what those questions are. And we'll make sure that we clear up any confusion or question before we keep going.
A question from Anton. Surely our times echo those of Francis, who are surrounded again by the pollution of worldliness and the need for conversion of the heart. The Franciscan charism is resurgent in such times.
I can't agree more. I think the more we understand what was the environment in which Francis was preaching and teaching and living, the more we see correspondences. And I think that should give us energy, should give us motivation, that while 800 years have passed, there are some ways in which we can really take on his call.
So far, I guess we're fine enough if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question. Brother Damien.
Yes, Sister, thank you so much for all of this already. It's very, very relevant to me as well. I'm actually was happy to hear you mention Darlene Prides. I'm in class with her currently. and we've actually just been discussing this very same thing, the idea that the Third Order, at least in principle, predates the Friars, and that the Friars, grew out of, in a way, grew out of the same movement that would ultimately become the Third Order. And I think it's important. Of course, I'm getting that that very definite commitment of Darlene's that the laity is such an important part of the Franciscan movement, and I'm very glad for to be reinforcing that perspective today. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. So your assignment is you've got to keep that voice going as you work with Darlene to help your confreres and fellow members here.
Anybody else at this point?
Just an observation, Charlie and sister. My read on church history is that the church has always tried to institutionalize movements of the Spirit, and they end up in that institutionalizing, killing the very spirit that started them. And that seems to happen over and over again in history. And what that really means is that every significant change in the life of the church was almost always lay-led.
Rick, I would respond and say, I think we need to be a little bit careful when we assume that the only result of church institutionalization is to kill the charism. Francis and Clare were absolutely opposed to any rupture with the church, even when that cost them dearly. So there is in their calling, I'm not saying it is true for everyone, and they had their church, and we've got ours. There was in them a kind of mystical appreciation of the importance of staying connected to the body of believers that stretched all the way back to the apostles. And I've just completed reading a beautiful, beautiful book by the Bishop of Assisi, Dominic Sorrentino, and I highly recommend it. It's called Accomplices of the Spirit. And he meditates on Guido and Francis. And he looks at the very question you've raised, Rick, which is, what is the role of the hierarchy? What is the role of the institution? And he writes these beautiful conversations that he has with Guido. And he says, like, Guido, weren't you a little nervous, about, sponsoring this madman that everybody thought was an idiot? So I think he's wrestling with that same thing. He's a bishop. If someone like Francis showed up in his front parlor today, what would he do? Would he send them away, or would he build a bridge? So I think the church itself has to always be on guard against that tendency in the church to reduce, to control, to manage. And all too often the church has done that. It has controlled and managed and reduced and sort of bleached the life out of certain initiatives. The worker priests of France would be an example of that. But on the other hand, I think we have to look at those who struggled to maintain the rapport and say, what was it they were after? But thank you for that. Janet.
Thank you, Sister Margaret. This is all so interesting and so relevant to where we are today. But I was interested in your evolution of the penitents and wondering about the role of women in that evolution and how prevalent women were in the penitential movement, and whether Clare herself identified with that before she made the move that she made.
Janet, clearly, and I won't go into chapter and verse on this, but when you go back through these ages of development, yes, women were part of that. And we might think, especially in the beginning of the development of monasticism, women like Macrina, you know, and her whole household of women who formed a kind of domestic monastery. So, but they moved from this penitential state to really founding monasteries and separating altogether. Clare, yes. When Clare is first received by Francis, she is not being received into a nunnery. She goes to one to visit, but the point is she's not going to stay there. And in the document of her canonization, she is called the Abbess of Penitence. So the imposition of a cloistered nun's life on Clare comes a full 5 years after she has begun her Franciscan life at San Damiano. Thank you for that, Janet. I think Brother Anton, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Sister. I'm intrigued by this last part of our conversation about, and I'm building on Rick's point here. Institutions today have lost credibility,
Yes.
generally speaking.
Yes.
We see a flight from the institutional. And so there's a kind of paradox here, because while Francis sought the blessing of the Pope in order to be, as you say, connected to the faithful, at the same time, he operated within the margin. And so I'm thinking that there is the virtues of marginalia, of minority,
Yes.
are critical here, because credibility in 2021, having a voice that people will listen to, is almost benefited by operating in the margins. In other words, not being seen as the authoritative cleric attached to the magisterium of the church, but rather as an itinerant seeking after mystical wisdom and mystical truth. And I find increasingly that people who call themselves secular unbelievers are nonetheless thirsty for a conversation around the mystical, not tied to the dogmatic. And I think there's a paradox here of inside out, outside in. You know, we work from the center of the circle, but also need to work from the circumference back inward. Anyway, just a thought, and I wanted to get your reaction.
You know, brother, you're right on. You just described something I think is very accurate, and I often express that when I'm giving a lecture by saying, Francis went to Rome and sought to get the authorization of the blessing from the highest church authority, because he knew without it that he couldn't have his brothers preaching lest they be linked with the heretics and everything would fall apart. But he did not stay in Rome and build a generalate. They went right back. You know, they stopped for a while in the little village of Orte and said, now what do we do? It was almost like, oh my God, he said, yes, now what? So I do think that I like to think of us as, if you think of the church as a house, the ecclesia is a house, we're the doorkeepers. In fact, we're really out on the front porch. And we're letting people come sit on the porch. And if they think they'd like to put their toe inside the door, we can open the door, but we can just sit on the front porch with them too, if that's as far as they want to come. So I think that you're so right about being at the margins. And that's how Francis got the okay from the church. They knew they needed that kind of talent if the whole thing wasn't going to start really imploding. So in that way, there was initially a recognition of, we've got to trust this, or woe is us, because we don't have a better answer right now.
Thank you, sis. Thank you, sister. Thank you, sister, for sharing. One of our Franciscan priests was asked by the wife of a priest Do we need another religion?
Another religion?
Yeah. Yeah, that was the question. Do we need another religion?
Oh,
Sister, what I would say is, that's a, people are asking that question, although I would say in our North American culture, they're just going to no religion. They're not leaving one religion for another, although that happens frequently enough. I think the dilemma becomes, where do you go if not to the feet of Jesus Christ? And who can best lead you to the feet of Jesus Christ? So there are lots of religions out there, and they're attractive, and they have, you know, a history, and they have leaders, and they have teachings and practices that at times I think can feel like, oh boy, you know, that feels to me like a better path for me. But I think once you open up that question, you need to be ready for some really, really serious negotiation. I will confess to you, you will remember that about 10 years ago, the Vatican initiated a kind of investigation of American Catholic nuns. At that point, I was ready to turn Buddhist. He said, you know, there's no Pope, you know, there's no Vatican. You know, I think it's a very restful religion. If I can learn to sit in lotus position, maybe that's what I'll do. But I was basically just expressing my frustration with being in this institution, which every so often makes life really, really difficult. So I just think we need to be utterly careful about that. And Francis himself was a repairer of the church. He didn't go to another religion. He worked within to uphold up the gospel. This is what we're about.
I want to act as maybe not a timekeeper,
Yeah,
but
we need to move on,
we need to
Charlie.
move on.
Okay,
And you can
right,
put in questions, put them in the chat. But
right,
we'll
okay, all right. So just one final comment in this exploration of Francis and the Order of Penance. One of the things that can make certain types of historians a little crazy is that we can't say, oh, well, you know, on November the 5th in the year 1207, Francis entered the Order of Penitence. There's no document, there's nothing that states that. Clearly, however, he did identify and become publicly identified as a penitent, which suggests that the local priests who got to know his work and his real spirit and the Bishop of Assisi were willing to acknowledge and grant him that status. Francis says it himself in the Testament. This is how the Lord inspired me, Brother Francis, to embark on a life of penance. So he's telling us that that's how he saw his life in the beginning. He speaks about leaving the world. I left the world after this happened. Of course, we know he doesn't mean he ascended into heaven. It's he left the values of secular life to embrace the penitential values. And the clearest indication of this is his trial in the presence of the Bishop of Assisi. His father is bringing a legal lawsuit against his son to recover the money and the goods that his father felt he had squandered illegally. The poor father is just driven absolutely to the extreme of suing this son who was so beloved. But he cannot be sued in the civil court because he is a penitent and he is under the jurisdiction of the bishop. So the trial moves to the house of the Bishop of Assisi. And once that trial is over, and with its, dramatic stripping of everything he has and returning everything to his father, he takes on a poor farmer's clothing that was given to him by one of the bishop's servants. He has already removed himself from his familial home, and he is really living, for all intents and purposes, in that earliest period as a hermit, but one who moves in and out of the city, begging for materials to help the churches and to help the poor. And we see the indication in some of the biographies that when the early lives of Francis describe how the first men joined him, Bernard, Giles, Sylvester, the words are, they were moved by his example of penance. So that penitent identity is the foundational stage of the calling of Francis. And I would even say that I think part of our call in the Franciscan family is to keep front and center this dynamic of a readiness to constantly be converted and converted again to God's plan for us, to our neighbor's needs. We know that even the earliest preaching and teaching that Francis and the brothers did was on penance. They were not given permission to preach learned sermons. They couldn't, they weren't educated that way. But there was clearly a practice of preaching to the people, a call to penance, a call to conversion, that Francis and the friars were authorized by the Pope to continue. And so the earliest kind of coming together with Francis were the men and women who heard that call, and especially those men and women who made decisions to accept the invitation of Francis to reform their lives along the lines of observing the gospel. And of course, Claire, as one of you mentioned earlier, Claire is an example of someone who heard the preaching and made the very same decision. And we see that when Claire is in her own home, before she even encounters Francis, what are we told? She sent food to the poor. She was very prayerful. She fasted. In other words, even before the influence of Francis brings her from her secular identity to that of a penitent, she is already in her home adopting some of those practices. So the preaching of Francis and the brothers is beginning to really have an effect and beginning to get the people in Assisi and other areas kind of sitting up and taking notice. If they thought he was a madman, they're beginning to rethink that evaluation. So we've gone through the evolution of penance as a state, an actual recognized way of life within the church. In the Middle Ages, it becomes the container, if you will, the wineskin, which Francis can adopt and use in that earliest period where, by his own admission, he's searching. He is constantly asking, what is it that God wills for him? And when we plot the great moments in his story, we can see you don't reduce it to one. We have a tendency to say, oh, it was when he kissed the leper. It's when he heard the cross of San Damiano, when he heard the call of the disciples and at the Mass of the Porciuncula. There are many moments in which his way forward is confirmed, and where he begins is not where he stays. He keeps moving according to the graces that are being given to him. So what I want to do now is turn to that next chapter, if you will. And that is to look at the Christian project of Francis and how it developed. I love this idea of the Christian project of Francis of Assisi. That language comes from Giovanni Miculi, who is one of the great lay historians in Italy, who has done monumental work to help us understand Francis in relationship to the culture of his time. And I think it's important for us to keep the idea of the Christian project. I think too quickly we begin to develop this kind of Franciscan monopoly of this is a Franciscan idea and the Franciscan preaching and the Franciscan program. The only program Francis had was the gospel. And so it's about living as a Christian, a truly committed, thoughtful, ever hearing, listening for the Spirit Christian. That's what he's after for himself and for everyone who's following him. And so what he and the brothers embark on is their project is to give good news about Christian life to the people. And I'm going to come to that good news part again a little bit later to speak to the fact that the way in which Francis would instruct the people about their potential for living a truly radical way of Christian living. And by radical, I don't mean a politically radical living, but a spiritually radical, at the root living, is really something that is extraordinarily attractive to people. And one of the things that my friend Joe Kenichi, who's a phenomenal historian, has said at one point, he said, we have a tendency when we describe Francis to focus on what made him exceptional, different, dramatic, his fasting, miracles, the different events in his life and the life of the early brothers, the visions, the voices. He said, I don't think people were eager to follow him because he was so weirdly different, but it was because he had something in common with them. They could see in him something that linked them as people of a place, of a culture, of a mindset, of a set of difficulties to overcome. And I think that's a very, very important insight. So who was in the audience when two friars would show up in Spoleto or Gubbio or Ravenna or Florence? Who was there? Well, we get an idea when we go to the rule of 1221, the friars' rule, and we read there what Francis is saying about who are we talking to. So bear with me as I remind us with this passage. All of us, lesser brothers, useless servants, humbly ask and beg those who wish to serve the Lord God within the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church and all the following orders: priests, deacons, subdeacons, acolytes, exorcists, lectors, porters, and all clerics, all religious men and women, all penitents and youths, the poor and the needy, kings and princes, workers and farmers, servants and masters, all virgins, continent and married women, all lay people, men and women, all children, adolescents, young and old, the healthy and the sick, the small and the great, all peoples, races, tribes, and tongues, all nations and all peoples everywhere on earth, to persevere in true faith and penance. Nobody is outside the pale to be invited to live in faith and penance. And it's really extraordinary when you start to think about it. I mean, the list is very precise at some moments, And then it is so expansive, it just takes your breath away. But that was one of the parts of his genius. He was not afraid to think in almost cosmic terms about what he was about, because he was experiencing how the Spirit was working through the brothers. And as Claire came into the movement, through the sisters as well, to bring people of every life station to look at how am I living my Christian commitments. Now, do we see that when Francis is done preaching, he says, now all of you who would like to sign up to be in the Third Order fraternity in Florence, come on up and we'll take your name and email. No, we don't have any activity like that that shows a direct institutionalizing by Francis of the people who wanted to enter into this Christian project. Probably he didn't need to, because the penitential life form was already there or already at hand for people to use. And I think it's less important to be able to prove that Francis created lay fraternities or groups than to recognize the fact that what was happening is the magnetic attraction of Francis and the brothers, because remember, the others are out also doing the preaching, and some of them were probably very, very excellent in doing this, that people are coming and saying, we want to be with you, we want to take part, we want to continue to live out this message. And so, however the movement goes from a sermon heard, a conversation engaged, to a group come together and begin to form a network of like-minded people, a guild, a fraternity, a sisterhood, we can begin to find out how that happened in some of these places. But it's one of those areas where it takes a whole lot of work to try to uncover that. But the fact that it was happening, the fact that the teaching of Francis began to penetrate the penitential movement already in existence is pretty overwhelming. So what we see there is that the earliest experience of people when they went to hear the preaching of the friars was one of being attracted and feeling there's something here for me to be part of. The great historian of the Middle Ages, Jacques Le Goff, had this to say, that for Francis, the Christian community was a set of categories with no hierarchies from a spiritual standpoint, all of them being equal as far as salvation is concerned. And that listing, I think, is the proof of that. Francis could put priest, lector, acolyte, and then he could put farmer and worker. And he could say, all of you are invited. All of you are being challenged to be part of this Christian project. We also see that within that first century, as different writers try to describe the early Franciscan events, they start to speak of the order of penances. They try to interpret and write a life of Francis. We see that, for example, Julian of Spire, who, if you have the big new volumes of the sources, wrote one of the Legenda, one of the lives of Francis. He speaks very clearly of the order of penance, and he even defines it. And Pope Gregory IX, who was Cardinal Ugolino, Francis' friend and protector, and sometimes perhaps his guardian in a way that was not always pleasing to Francis, he also starts to speak later after the death of Francis of founding a threefold army of the faithful. And we have to understand that the papacy was interested in helping and protecting these lay fraternities and maybe with mixed motives, certainly to promote Christian life, but also to make sure that these laity were on the papal side in the never-ending fights between the Pope and the Emperor. And I think that today our interpretations center on how Francis was part of this order of penance. More and more modern historians of the Franciscan movement are beginning to acknowledge that that order of penance foundation is absolutely where it all began. I will say, and Charlie, I don't know if you were there the evening of this happening, but when I first began my studies at the Franciscan Institute, this was the late 1970s. The Third Order regular historian Raphael Pazzelli came to give a lecture, and he stood up and he made that statement, you know, that the penitents were first, that Francis had this enormous impact, that the lay movement became the ground for the rest of the order. And all hell broke loose in the question and answer session because the First Order friars weren't having it. And I think it was one of my first experience of watching scholars go at each other, hammer and tongs. But that was then, and now I think Raphael's position has been validated by many other great minds. So I'm going to stop here. The next thing I want to do is take us then into how was Francis teaching about penance in a way that made people want to be part of that? How did he make penance attractive or conversion attractive? But before we go to that part 4, let's take another pause and see if we've got questions. We've got about 50 minutes left here. Questions or comments?
Yes. So I'm going to suggest, I mean, my memory of Raphael is in his neatly with the cigarette in one hand and a martini in the other hand.
Right.
I'm going to suggest, in deference to Brother Body, Brother Ass, we just stand and shake a little bit.
Okay. Do we need a little longer pause, Charlie? Should we say maybe a 10-minute break?
No, I think, what's the census? Do you want? I see Janet nodding her head. So why don't we do that? And that way we'll be in good shape, because I think the next section is going to be very important.
Right, right. So let's take 10 minutes, check your watch, whatever your watch says, wherever you are.
10
And
minutes.
in 10 minutes, we'll be back. And I'm just going to leave my screen like this.
So that would be 12:20 Eastern time.
Okay.
It's a small world, the Franciscan world, right? Small
It is.
Franciscan world. You know, I was there that night Margaret was talking about with Raphael and the kind of the fight that happened. I think it was in the chapel, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
I think it was not even the sanctuary stopped the, but the fact that that happened in 1978, which in our lifetime sounds like a long time, but is relatively new to how radical these ideas really were, and how we're blessed to be in this time when we know. And I had shared with Margaret how it has struck me, the more I've dug into this, how remarkable that when he started us in 1917, right, in 2017, we had our 100th anniversary, Father Joseph referred to us always as the Order of Penance. And how did this American Episcopal priest know that back in 1917? I'd love to know how he got that, how he
Right.
knew of this, you know. But anyway, we begin again.
Okay.
I'll
So
start.
we're moving now to part 4 in your outline, which is recovering a biblical meaning of penance and conversion. So I do think that we immediately understand, and I'm not sure because I realize in different cultures and different languages, the word penance may have different associations, but for the most part, when you speak of penance to someone and say, I'm from the order of penance, they're like, ooh, what is that? Because penance has a negative overtone of something hard and against nature that I have to do or that I'm being forced to do. And so it's one of the barriers, the linguistic overtones of that word. It's one of the barriers that needed to be overcome when people back in the 70s and 80s began to take this question seriously. So what I want to describe to you is the result of a great deal of research that really began when, for those of us in the Catholic Church, following the Second Vatican Council, there literally was an instruction given to us to renew our communities by going to the charism of the founder. And that was a really inspired instruction within the church. To be candid, I think Pope Paul VI had a brilliant Jesuit advisor who knew this and understood that the theological path was really important. And as different groups of religious began to go back and say, when were we founded? By whom? What was the rule? What was the goal? More and more started to come to light to help us understand why the ancient title for all of us was Brothers and Sisters of the Order of Penance of St. Francis. Let me, however, begin by quoting another very important Italian historian, Giovanni Casagrande. This is the summary given in her study of what a penitential lifestyle is. We can deduce the essence of penance in terms of behavior and attitudes: love of God, neighbor, and enemies, mercy, charity, almsgiving, hatred of the body with its vices and sins. Not a popular, I add, not a popular way to talk these days. Confession of sins, reception of sacraments, humility, not serving the world, fasting, abstinence from excessive food and drink. Those were the external markers. What Casagrande is missing is the inner fire of the call to conversion that made the message of Francis so magnetic and so attractive. For me, the question is, wasn't there a deeper channel of wisdom, of the working of the Spirit about the search for God that motivated people to say, I want to be part of this. I want my life to mirror this. So in 1974, the friars of the Third Order Regular held an international conference in Madrid, Spain. To that conference, they invited the masculine orders that followed the rule of St. Francis. To give you an example, Brotherhood from Holland, a Brotherhood from Germany, a Brotherhood from Ireland, a Brotherhood from Brooklyn, New York. There are multiple small, not very well-known or famous congregations of men who are Franciscans, but not friars minor. They follow the Third Order rule. When they came together to listen to research that was done on what was the meaning of the original order of penance. And from that research, a whole series of teaching and gatherings and consultations began so that Franciscan sisters became engaged in the same exploration. And there was a kind of flowering of a recognition that very few understood the power that Francis had invested in this call to penance. And I want to share this with you in a little bit of detail, because I think a lot is at stake here. I think it's really important for us to understand that the notion of being a penitent got diminished over time, even sidelined, not because it wasn't a valid and valuable way of understanding a vocation, but because translations and cultural shifts separated us from the original inspiration and intention. So the early consultations were published originally by the Third Order Regular Friars because they had the kind of scholastic center in Rome that allowed for the study. In the US, the Franciscan journal, The Cord, 10 years later, became the vehicle to democratize and share a good bit of this. And what I'm about to share is really based on work that was done principally in the beginning by Father Roland Faley, who was a scripture scholar and the general minister of the Third Order Regular, and then enhanced by work by people like Sister Nancy Salaski and Father Bernard Tickerhoof of the Third Order, who had an expertise in language and linguistics. And so here's what we have learned that can take us back to those origins. In the New Testament, when Jesus calls the first followers to reform their lives because the kingdom is at hand, the word that is used in the Greek first translations is metanoia. And metanoia has a verb form, and I think some of you may be more adept in Greek and Hebrew than I will ever be. I believe the pronunciation is metanoete. In other words, what the hearer of Jesus understood and what the readers of the Greek New Testament understood is, this is an active turning of my life over to the actions of God in my life. So I'm calling you to a converted life. I'm calling you to change. I'm calling you to take on the belief that the reign of God is at hand and you must live accordingly. So it was the clarion call of Jesus, out of which was formed his apostles, his disciples, and the first Christian communities. However, when the New Testament was finally translated into Latin, very big event in the history of, the Christian story, Saint Jerome takes the word metanoia, the call to convert your life, and it becomes the call facere penitentia or agere penitentia. You must do penance. You must make penance. Penance is a noun form. It's not active. It's something. And therefore, in a subtle but really, really important way for our complete understanding, is the idea of penance gradually over time becomes identified as that thing you do to erase sin and to become a better and more faithful Christian. And in fact, one of the things that we see is the persons who've done, the really hard work of looking at these translations and looking at these shifts in meaning say to us that part of the dilemma around penance is you always have to add the action verb. So you either do penance, you make a penance is imposed upon you, you accept a penance, but the penance is outside of you in a way. I hope you follow what I'm saying. And so the penance becomes that thing which is hard, which is challenging, which requires a strong effort and willpower. Whereas metanoia was more of an internal attitude in which everything about me becomes gradually transformed in correspondence to God's design for my life. And we know there are people for whom that metanoia moment is so defining that everything changes forever. Paul of Tarsus. We know for others, the metanoia moment is an ongoing lifetime adventure. And so the notion of the word penance over time becomes, in a sense, laden with this idea of a thing to be done. It gets reduced in a way to an action of atonement. What Francis did when he called people to penance, he restored the original understanding of the Greek New Testament. Did he go and study a Greek New Testament? No. But we know that the Spirit was powerfully acting on Francis to inspire the way in which he would invite people. We also know that Francis spent time with learned persons. After all, he sought hospitality in monasteries. He was befriended by bishops. He may have had some deeper knowledge of this, but the point is, he reinvigorated the idea of penance in a way that was like a lightning strike within the Christian community from that point forward. So what we see is Francis offers the people an understanding that to do penance is, as somebody just put in the chat, it's the joyful experience of realizing I'm called by God and God has a plan for me. And this is a loving God that is inviting me into a deeper communion with God, but also with my neighbor, because at the root of the teaching of Francis, as the root of the teaching of Jesus, is the great commandment. When the young man comes and says, Lord, what must I do? Jesus begins with where every Jew begins, the Shema. Love the Lord your God with your whole heart and soul and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That's where Francis begins. And it's so basic and so simple, but it is so all-encompassing once we really understand and get into that. And so what I would like to do now is take you on a little adventure with that very earliest letter, which has been called the Letter to the Faithful or the Early Exhortation. In fact, I have counted, and the last time I counted, there are 14 different names given to this particular text of St. Francis, which can be very annoying and unhelpful to us as we try to understand what are the very important parts of our inheritance as the Franciscan penitents. So if we could go then to the last part on the Letter to the Faithful, I think that's where we want to be. So here we go. I have come to a very strong conviction that while this document is a letter, and we know that Francis understood the value of written texts and that he, in fact, gave instructions that written texts representing his ideas should be copied and shared. In other words, he was using, if I may say so, the technology of his time. Bear in mind, people were not literate. Ordinary men and women couldn't read, and they could not write. So Francis sees the critical importance of texts that can help people understand and get guidance when the preacher is no longer with them. In this very first version of the letter to the faithful, which some people think came after the longer version and is supposed to be like the Cliff Notes version, Francis really puts forth an extraordinary program of Christian living. And what I believe is important for us is to take this and other documents like it and really plumb the depths so that we understand our calling as penitents, and begin to grab onto the very, very powerful roots of that calling. So I'm going to, read segments and, interrupt. So at the very beginning, this letter, I think, really is a summary of the key points of the preaching that he and the brothers would do. In other words, it may be in letter form, but it started as teaching. And someone was taking good notes. And someone assisted Francis in putting those notes into a letter form to preserve for the lay men and women what was central to this call to conversion to a full Christian life. Where does he begin? Those who do penance, all those who love the Lord with their whole heart, soul, mind, and their whole strength, and their neighbor as themselves, is where he begins. And then he adds, which does not sit well on our modern ears, and who hate their bodies with vices and sins. And we need to think about that phrase and recapture a contemporary understanding of it. And who receive the body and blood of our Lord and produce worthy fruits of penance. So he starts out, and it's addressed to the men and the women. So clearly, this is not something related to friars who by this time, 1221, are already in a religious, vowed, constitutionally based path. It's not intended for Claire and her sisters alone. It is all those categories of men and women that I mentioned earlier. Now listen to this. He says, how happy and blessed are these men and women when they do these things, since the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon them. Now, what isn't included here, there's just a little scripture citation, Isaiah 11. But what is Isaiah 11? Isaiah 11 is the calling out of all the gifts of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit of the Lord will come upon them, fortitude, justice, temperance, piety, fear of the Lord. In other words, when you do this, the Spirit of the Lord comes to you in its fullness. This is not a brand B kind of Christian living. And he says, God will make his dwelling with you. And they become children, spouses, brothers, and mothers of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then the next whole section of this letter, he teases out the meaning of those words. We are spouses when the soul is joined to Christ by the Spirit. Listen to that. The Spirit of God joins us to Jesus. It's spousal. It's that intimate. We're mothers when we do good and the world can see and we bring forth, the Italian word for giving birth is to carry to the light, porta alla luce. When we bring to light good deeds, it's like mothering the life of Jesus in the midst of the people. And we are brothers when we do the will of the Father in heaven, because we are brothers and sisters to Jesus in obedience to the Father. And he goes on from that point. How wonderful it is to have this Father in heaven, to have such a spouse, to have a brother, our Lord Jesus Christ. And he goes on, and then he concludes with a kind of riff on the prayer that Jesus prays at the Last Supper, the prayer for unity. Holy Father, protect those you have given me from the world. Why did Francis choose this particular scripture passage? I think it is because he comes to understand that just as Jesus had followers who separated themselves from their families, their homes, their possessions, their trades, to really give their lives to his service, so these men and women are following Francis, and they are doing similar acts of renunciation, of penitence, of Christian charity. And Francis can say, as Jesus did, you have given these to me. They were yours and you have given them to me. And they have accepted and believed the word I have spoken to them. In other words, Francis sees that his experience has mirrored that of Jesus with the earliest followers in the Christian community. Now, when we sit with this letter, which I believe has to be seen as the spiritual foundation for the 1221 Memoriale that became the legislative program, we realize Francis is not inviting the penitent to a watered down version of what it means to live a life converted to the gospel. Francis, in fact, is putting before the brothers and sisters, who by this time are growing in number, just as the friars are growing in number, he puts before them the most exalted description of intimacy with God, expressed in good works done for the neighbor, that one can possibly imagine. And the beautiful genius is he doesn't use highfalutin Greek and Latin theological terms. He uses the terms of a household: brother, mother, sister, spouse. Who can't understand what that means? Who can't say, I didn't get it? I don't know what he's selling. And so Francis has placed before all of those men and women an extraordinary Magna Carta of the spiritual foundation for living a life of metanoia, of penance, of conversion. In fact, when you put this alongside the unapproved rule that he wrote for the friars in 1221, it is amazing how many correspondences there are. So what that tells us is it wasn't necessarily a kind of schizophrenic situation, which there's one message for the friars, there's another message for you poor lay people who don't have the calling to be friars. No. The message at the heart is the same. But what has happened over time is already there is a beginning of a parting of the pathways, with the friars moving more and more for the guidance and protection of the church as an order, and the laymen and women being, in a sense, dispersed in ever so many towns and cities, not limited anymore to Italy either. It's beginning to take place in other parts of Europe as the friars leave Italy to share and to minister. So what we see here, I think, is a recognition that we really need to understand and appreciate and cherish that our call begins with the most fundamental strengths of the Judeo-Christian tradition in the Great Commandment and proceeds to the greatest contemplative possibility for any human being who lives in the graced action of the Holy Spirit. I think once we have grasped this, once we have taken it to heart, once we have shared with one another, I think we begin to understand that our calling as brothers and sisters of penance is a joyful gift to be protected, to be explored, to be shared. And that as we celebrate this 800th anniversary, we take we kind of fill our lungs up with some new fresh air about what it means to be in this order of penance. And it's not something that we are worried about or apologetic about. It's something where we realize our birthright as the penitents of Francis is splendid. So I'm going to stop there and see what your questions or comments might be.
Thanks, Margaret. I see I've got a new companion here who is squawking for my attention.
See them, brother Beast.
Yes, Kate, Sister Beast.
Oh, Sister Beast.
Jan
Begging your pardon.
Strickler writes, I've thought of this also in the context of living in right relationship with the rest of creation. Real conversion of life, not turning away from, like the list of penitential behaviors, not eating meat, all that, but a turning towards, focusing on God rather than myself, lover of neighbor, human and beyond human.
Thank you. And I think that comment also lifts up, I think, one of the realities that we need to keep exploring in our branch of the family, which is what is the spiritual and psychological and, worked out pathway of conversion, because it's never finished. So, for example, there is such a call to us now about the climate crisis. And a lot of that crisis is because a lot of people don't want to be converted to accept the reality and to make the sacrifices needed to avert further damage to our planet. So we're constantly confronted by new calls to conversion. And we need to be discerning. Not all of them are from the Holy Spirit, but I think that being, if you will, the experts on how I stay attuned to the call to conversion, how I face the obstacles to a call to conversion is an important thing for us. What
Several
else do we have?
Several have mentioned the joy of metanoia, a spirit of joy and hope.
Right.
Brother Desmond, I guess, has joined us, and he says, a new mind, wonderful. He's wondering about the Aramaic behind the Greek. What would the Aramaic have been?
Now you're above my pay grade on that one. I would have to really go to someone with a better knowledge of that. So, and I'm sure I've probably heard it, but candidly, the notes that I've worked from all these years start with the Greek, not with the Aramaic.
Rick points to the fact that metanoia has been a key motivator in the Cursillo movement and the joy it brings and why it works. Anton has a comment on Otto Scharmer, the need to shift from learning to be present to cultivating presencing, in a similar way to go from noun to verb. Then penance goes to penancing, acting in the presence of the living God. Franciscan makes a decision to look for God in every moment and everything and everyone.
Thank you for that. I'm a little bit familiar with the work of Sharma, but it sounds as though you could take that and really develop another whole understanding that could be helpful to all of us. Thank you.
And then he also talks of the familiar intimacy that's the joy of the penitent.
Right, right.
This not mean experiencing Christ is sensuous. If so, then joy is not in denigrating the world, but revealing the beauty inside the restoration of the spirit. Teilhard, matter is spirit moving slowly enough that it can be seen.
Right.
I would guess.
I actually heard a Shakespearean scholar give a talk once on his belief that the Franciscans, and he was speaking of the friars, were Epicureans, that they were people who loved things of the world. And his example, among his examples, that was the friars in the writings of Shakespeare. And he talked about how Friar Lawrence, instead of telling Romeo and Juliet, oh, tisk tisk, you two are making trouble, he really tried to help them achieve their goal of being united in love, and so it's this positive embrace of the goodness in the world that is so much a part of the Franciscan profile, and that is the joy. We're here in a world created by God for us, and Jesus is the firstborn of creation. So there is a great joy to be had as we get freed up from our not understanding our Christian inheritance.
I think we have a few more minutes if people would just want to unmute yourself if you want to make an observation or raise a question. We've got about 10 minutes, 8 minutes in our schedule.
Yep.
Anyone?
I will try to get the Aramaic question answered, but I don't have it at hand.
Yeah, I hope I wasn't just trying to be clever. It just occurred to me that we were already, and I'm not a linguist at all, I don't have any language abilities, but we were already dealing with a translation once we see the New Testament.
Yes,
Greek.
exactly. Right. It's a very good point.
It
So,
depends on the part of the New Testament. Jesus spoke Aramaic, so that comment would be accurate for the Gospels, but not for the other writings, which
Right.
were originally written in Greek.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a question that's a little step or two to the left or to the right of what we've been talking about, but it's the thought of that 1221 rule and the rule setting third order people or penitents a bit apart from the culture. And one of the prescriptions was that third order Franciscans could not bear arms. And that's kind of been lost in the modern rule. And I'm wondering, what does anybody know the history of how that aspect of our calling got changed or de-emphasized, or I don't know what the right word would be.
I don't have the expertise on that point, John. I will say this. I have been cautioned by Father Joe Kenichi that even though that was stated in the early rule, it was not universally implemented, because if you were bearing arms for the Pope, that was okay. Now, I'm out on a limb with that, but I think he had reason to believe that there were variations in how that was observed. So I do think, obviously, the peacemaking work of Franciscans has gone through the centuries without question. But I think the organized documents of the order have all refrained from taking a pacifist position where you would be excommunicated if, for example, you were in the military. So it's always a very, very complex issue, in terms of bearing arms or engaging in any kind of armed conflict, although we know the modern popes have said there is no such thing as a just war. It's the deeper you go into the question. But I think that's worth some exploration, and I'll keep an eye out on that one.
My recollection, Margaret, and it wouldn't do with the living out of it over time, but that there was a synod in Spain, maybe a couple of hundred years, maybe in the 1100s or around 1000, that codified a lot of the practices of the penitent,
Okay.
and one of them was not to bear arms. So that would have been something that came in from the
Yeah.
earlier
Yeah,
practices of the penitents.
right.
Yeah.
I do think, I mean, when we understand the incredible level of violence that existed in the time of Francis, the constant warfare between city-states, between Pope and Emperor, trying to, put a barrier to that was certainly a strong part of the Franciscan program. Is why Francis went to the Middle East hoping to convert the Sultan, hoping to end the crusade.
Anybody else? Any comments? Well, I think I'm going to, well, I certainly give my thanks to Margaret, but I think I'm going to ask our Minister Provincial to. I think you're muted, Janet.
So, Sister Margaret, can we just come live with you and sit in your living room and take all this in all the time? It would be wonderful.
Absolutely,
Thank
absolutely.
you so much for all that you've imparted to us and given us to think about and pray about and be joyous about. This has been wonderful. Charlie sang your praises, and he didn't sing them loud enough. So thank you so much for being with us.
Well, Janet, thank you. And I would add, I certainly would be happy to be of assistance going forward. I have a lot of, good files and reports and materials that could be helpful. It doesn't always need to be me. We do have some colleagues who are very good, on these themes, but if I can be helpful, and maybe I'll just end with a very short anecdote about the joy of being penitent. I had the opportunity to help plan an international conference of the Third Order in Assisi back in the late 80s, early 90s. And one of the things we talked about was, you usually try to develop in the evenings a kind of recreation that everybody could enjoy. So we came up with the idea that we would do a recreation that would try to mirror when Francis and Claire met at the Porziuncola and conversed about God, and people thought the woods had become on fire. So we planned on our last evening together, we would have a very festive dinner. People would be invited to dress in their native garb if they had it with them, and many did. And then we went outside, and the conference center built an enormous bonfire for us. And every different national group had to sing something around that fire for the rest of us to enjoy. And it began with Robert Mueller, who at that time was Under Secretary of the United Nations, playing Ode to Joy on his harmonica.
Oh my gosh.
And within the hour, some young people from Assisi are standing at the edge. They're peeking through the bushes. They're kind of like, so we went over and said, would you like to come in? He said, what are you? What are you doing? You're having so much fun. And we said, see, if you create the conditions, the old stories become our story. So I think we have to have the courage to celebrate, and to celebrate with imagination, because there's enough suffering and pain and disillusion in our world right now.
Mhm.
And people don't need adding to pain and dissolution. They need hope, love, and joy. So I encourage you to be about that, dear brothers and sisters of penance.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you all very much.
Mhm. I would like to get back to you about the Joint Committee on Franciscan Unity and the Federation of the Brothers and Sisters, but we'll do that another time.
All right. Thank
All
you,
right.
Janet.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you, Charlie.
Yeah.
Goodbye, everyone. God's blessings
Bye.
on all of your work.